a drunken father, a dishonored son. A curse spoken in anger, or was it prophecy? Few stories in the Bible carry as much mystery and weight as the moment Noah awoke from his wine and declared, "Cursed be Canaan." Why did he curse his grandson instead of his son Ham, who had dishonored him? Was it a punishment, or was Noah glimpsing into the dark future of Canaan's descendants? What began as a simple family incident would unravel over the course of 400 years, leading to one of the most controversial divine commands in history, the order for Israel to wipe out the Canaanites completely. Who were these people? Why did God declare their destruction? And how did their fate connect to a drunken night in Noah's tent? The answers are woven through prophecy, sin, judgment, and ultimately redemption. This is the untold story of Canaan's curse and the destruction of his descendants. A chilling but powerful account of how sin can span generations and how even the most cursed people can find redemption in God's plan. As the scorching sun cast its golden glow upon the land, the old man lay in his tent, the scent of wine heavy in the air. Noah, the man who had walked with God, who had witnessed the destruction of the old world and the birth of a new one, had taken of the vineyard he planted and drank too much. In his weariness he lay exposed in his tent. It was a simple moment, one that should have passed unnoticed, but instead, it became the seed of a prophecy that would unfold over centuries. Ham, Noah's son, entered the tent and saw his father's nakedness. What exactly transpired in that moment is unclear, but the scriptures tell us that rather than covering his father, he went out and spoke of it, as if mocking the one whom God had chosen to save humanity. When Shem and Japheth, his brothers, heard of it, they walked backward into the tent, a garment stretched between them so that they would not see their father's shame. In reverence they covered Noah, preserving his dignity. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, a strange and startling thing occurred. He did not curse Ham, the one who had dishonored him, but instead he cursed Ham's son, Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Genesis 9 verse 25. Why Canaan? The scriptures do not tell us explicitly. Perhaps Noah, through divine insight, saw something in Canaan's heart, a seed of rebellion that would grow into something dark and twisted. Or perhaps the curse was prophetic, a glimpse into the future of Canaan's descendants, who would become the most corrupt of all nations. Whatever the reason, the words were spoken, and they would echo through history, waiting for their fulfillment. The descendants of Canaan settled in the rich and fertile lands of what would later be called Canaan, stretching from the Great Sea to the Jordan River. They built great cities, Jericho, Hazor, and Ai, establishing themselves as a powerful people. But with their rise came something far more sinister. The blood of Canaan carried a curse, and his descendants embraced depravity with open arms. Generation after generation, the Canaanites turned from the one true God and descended into the worship of false deities. They built towering altars to Baal and Asherah, gods of fertility and war, indulging in vile rituals. Their religious practices were marked by unthinkable sins, temple prostitution, incest, bestiality, and the darkest of all horrors, child sacrifice. In the valley of Hinnom, infants were placed into the burning hands of Molech, their screams rising into the night as their parents sought favor from a God who did not speak, who did not hear, who only devoured. But God did not act hastily. He watched as the Canaanites spiraled deeper into corruption. When he spoke to Abraham, he revealed a startling truth. Your descendants will be strangers in a land not their own and will be enslaved for 400 years. But after that, they will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Genesis 15 verses 13 to 16. 400 years. 4 centuries of patience, waiting for the Canaanites to turn from their wickedness. But they did not. They grew worse, their cities becoming cesspools of immorality. The land groaned under their sin, and the heavens bore witness to their evil. And then the time came. From the burning bush, the voice of Yahweh called to Moses, sending him to Pharaoh to free the descendants of Abraham, who had become slaves in Egypt. The plagues fell, the Red Sea parted, and Israel began its journey toward the land that had been promised to them. But the land was not empty. It was filled with the very people whose ancestors had been cursed by Noah, people who had chosen darkness over light, death over life. As Israel stood on the borders of Canaan, the Lord spoke to Moses. You must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, for they will turn your hearts after other gods. Deuteronomy 7 verses 2-4. To modern ears these words sound severe, even harsh. But this was not an act of random destruction, it was divine judgment. God had given the Canaanites 400 years to repent, but they had only grown more wicked. Their presence in the land was a poison, one that would lead Israel into the very same corruption if they were allowed to remain. And so, when Moses' successor, Joshua, led the people into the land, the conquest began. The first great battle came at Jericho. The city's mighty walls seemed impenetrable, but God commanded the Israelites to march around it in silence for 6 days. On the 7th day the trumpets sounded, and with a mighty roar the walls crumbled to the ground. The city was put to the sword and everything was destroyed, save for one woman and her family. Rahab, the harlot, had heard of the God of Israel. She had hidden the Israelite spies and begged for mercy. And mercy was given. The scarlet cord in her window marked her as one who would be saved, and she was brought into Israel, later becoming an ancestor of King David, and ultimately Jesus Christ himself. The conquest continued. Ai fell. Hazor burned. The sun stood still at Gibeon. The judgment of God swept across the land, city after city, until the power of the Canaanites was broken. Yet Israel did not fully obey. They left some of the Canaanites alive, failing to drive them out completely. And just as God had warned, the poison of idolatry remained. The Canaanite gods became a snare to Israel, leading them away from Yahweh. They too fell into child sacrifice, worshipped Baal, and were eventually exiled from the land just as the Canaanites had been. Let's see why the Israelites failed to completely drive out the Canaanites now. Despite God's command to utterly destroy the Canaanites, the Israelites failed to carry out the conquest fully. Several key reasons explain why they did not complete the task. 1. Disobedience and lack of faith. God had given clear instructions. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Deuteronomy 20 verses 16-17. Yet, after some initial victories, Israel began to disobey. They spared certain Canaanite groups, failing to trust in God's command and instead relying on their own judgment. For example, when Israel encountered the Gibeonites, the people of Gibeon deceived them by pretending to be from a far-off land. Instead of consulting God, Israel made a treaty with them, Joshua 9, allowing them to live. This was one of the first cracks in their obedience. 2. Fear of the enemy's strength. Some Canaanite cities, especially those in the hill country, were heavily fortified, with large populations and advanced military strength. When the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh complained to Joshua, saying they couldn't drive out the Canaanites because they had iron chariots, Joshua rebuked them, reminding them of God's promise, Joshua 17 verses 16-18. But their fear of superior technology and manpower caused them to hesitate. 3. Desire for tribute instead of destruction. Instead of eliminating the Canaanites, some Israelite tribes chose to enslave them and make them pay tribute. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor but did not drive them out completely. Judges 1 verse 28. This decision was economically beneficial in the short term but disastrous in the long run. By keeping the Canaanites as laborers instead of destroying their influence, Israel absorbed their culture and idolatry, leading to spiritual corruption. 4. Gradual loss of zeal. When Joshua and his generation passed away, the next generation did not fully know the Lord or his works. They grew comfortable and complacent, neglecting their divine mission. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Judges 2 verse 10. Without strong leadership, Israel lacked the drive to complete the conquest. The unfinished task left pockets of Canaanites throughout the land, setting the stage for future spiritual failures. How Israel eventually lost Canaan, the exile. The failure to remove the Canaanites completely led to the downfall of Israel itself. Over time, the Israelites intermarried with the Canaanites, worshipped their gods and fell into idolatry, the very thing God had warned them about. Despite great rulers like David and Solomon, later kings fell into Canaanite idolatry. Kings such as Ahab and Manasseh introduced Baal worship and child sacrifice, the same evils practiced by the Canaanites before them. Eventually, God's patience ran out, just as it had with the Canaanites. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered and exiled by Assyria because they had turned away from God. 2 Kings 17 verses 7-23. In 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was exiled by Babylon, with Jerusalem and the temple destroyed. 2 Chronicles 36 verses 15-20. Ironically, the Israelites suffered the same fate as the Canaanites, driven out of the land because of their rebellion. Israel's failure to drive out the Canaanites was not due to a lack of strength, but a lack of faith and obedience. Instead of fully trusting in God's command, they compromised, seeking temporary gain over eternal righteousness. But sin, once tolerated, does not remain idle. Like the Canaanites before them, Israel was eventually consumed by the very corruption they failed to remove. And so, history repeated itself. Just as the Canaanites were exiled for their wickedness, so too was Israel, driven from the land they once possessed. The land that had been promised to them became a land lost. But even in judgment, God's mercy remained. Though Israel fell, He did not forsake them. He promised restoration, and in time He brought them back. More than that, through Jesus Christ, the descendant of Rahab, He opened the door of salvation, not just to Israel but to the whole world, including those once cursed. This story is not just about Israel and the Canaanites. It is a warning to every generation. What we fail to remove today can destroy us tomorrow. Sin cannot be bargained with, it must be cast out completely. And yet, even when we fail, God remains faithful, always ready to restore those who truly seek Him.